Assalamu alaikum, namaste, sasrika and shalom. Thank you to the Albeit Society for the invite today and the slip of the tongue for Strathclyde University, although I was at Strathclyde and Glasgow University. I think I was given a theme in terms of what to talk by Zarina, and I was told about education being a fundamental right, which should be maintained at all times, even if in the most difficult circumstances we see around the world today, as Nicola touched upon, with regards to conflict. And I was thought long and hard about it since yesterday when I arrived back from Barcelona about what to say today. And when I was considering the topic of education, what came to mind was, even before we get to the question of education for young people around the world today, is to consider what many young people are actually going through. What we take for granted in terms of education. When I took my children to bonfire night last night, and when they demanded to go on every I probably should speak to Eva and to the council about the costs of the rides and the costs of fish and chips at Glasgow Green, but the fact that how they take for granted everything that's given to them. And I considered, as I saw my children go on the rides and demand for this ride and that ride, and a couple of rides my son took me on I wish he hadn't done, but when I considered that only last month we saw the story appear in the newspapers of a food bank worker who told MSPs a family had been referred to the school in this city after a schoolboy aged 8 had been caught stealing sachets of tomato sauce from the school canteen to make soup, as the family had nothing to eat. And that's the reality, the sad reality of what we face today. Demand at the Trussell food banks has increased by up to 80% since the introduction of universal credit. Since 2010, the number of children in absolute poverty has increased by 500,000. The number of children in relative poverty will have risen from 2.3 million to 2.6 million in 2020. So the question of education is, well, what comes first? And when you look at childcare and housing, these are two of the costs that take the biggest toll on families' budgets today. And when you consider what teachers have to cope with nowadays, teachers, I mean, I know my 3 children are probably the most precious things in my life, and when children are sent to school, we rely on our teachers, not just to give them an education, but to hold their hands, to pick them up when they fall, when they see tears, to find out what's been going wrong, to challenge them on racism, to teach them music, to teach them the love of science and education. But so many places around the world, teachers don't get the opportunity to do that. In fact, often schools and teachers are the first targets of attack, the first target of conflict. They're the first places that are flattened by bombs that are often built in the West today. And as a lawyer, I often talk about human rights in the context of justice and the right to a fair trial or the right to free speech. But many people also forget that human rights also means the right to an education, the right to healthcare, the right to adequate housing, and the right to be able to eat, of course, is a fundamental human right. And the problem, of course, is that all these rights are signed up to by the UK government. There's absolutely no way, though, of holding the UK government to account for failing to meet these standards required by our international obligations. And today, when you look across the globe, the world which is full of conflict, full of poverty, children are usually and always the first to suffer. And often we used to think of children in the third world. Well, when we look now what's happening within the United States, under Donald Trump's policies, which has exposed the horrors that children can face with regards to immigrants arriving in the United States. And whilst we slam Donald Trump, it seems to me that across Europe, we have no problem of separating children from families or denying them the basic necessities such as education, healthcare and dignity. And separation from children, as we've seen in this city, as we've seen in other cities, as we welcome refugees. Separation from families leaves children more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, no matter what the care setting. Traumatic separation from parents, whether through civil war, through famine, invasion or immigration laws, creates the stress in children and adolescents that can profoundly impact on their development and education. But I think we can also draw inspiration from the many ordinary people who have chosen to stand up and fight against these horrors, not just in Europe, but in the United States and across this world. And if I can take a jump from across the ocean, from the United States to countries, other places like Yemen, where we have seen the impact of war on children. We see a Saudi-led war on Yemen, which has devastated a country already crippled by widespread poverty and systematic neglect. In 2015, Saudi Arabia and its allies launched what has become a vicious unrelenting assault on the defenseless population. Despite tens of thousands of airstrikes, debilitating air and naval blockades, they have failed to dislodge the rebels, but devastation and destruction is the norm. And as a result now, Yemen faces the largest humanitarian emergency on the planet. Some 14 million people are at risk of starving to death, according to a World Food Programme report. It's the most severe famine anywhere in the world for more than 100 years. 16 million people lack access to clean water. A staggering 22 million people, 75% of the population, rely on aid. And the United Nations estimates that more than 3 million Yemenis have fled their homes, desperately seeking safety and security. Many now live in makeshift refugee camps. Their weathered tents are the only signs of life in an otherwise inhospitable landscape. And when you look to what the Western world does, it simply turns its face away. It's complicit in the silence as far as I'm concerned. They've watched as Saudi Arabia has tried to bully NGOs to stop aid programs in rebel-controlled regions, and when persuasion has failed, they've used violence. Hospitals run by Médecins Sans Frontières have been bombed many times. Save the Children, an international human rights organization, estimates that 50,000 children died from poverty-related causes last year. That's 137 pairs of smiling eyes left vacant each day. A final and bitter embrace every 10 minutes for their families. And in truth, Yemen no longer exists. And that calamity is an indictment of the United States and the British governments, which have expanded their military sales to the Saudis. A bomb that killed 40 children on a school bus in August was almost certainly produced in Texas. And not satisfied with facilitating indiscriminate murder in this way, the West also provides secondary support, which includes intelligence on possible targets, in-air refueling, and bombing campaigns. And almost 30 million Yemenis are suffering a brutal military regime. That's an example of a war being conducted. And when we ask the question of education, we know what happened to the education of the Yemeni children. There is literally no education for their children. And even when you look to Britain, if you look to the Third World and compare Britain in 1800 with the Third World of today, what we see is exactly the same system, a system that would rather break children's backs to get profit than to give them an education. And the mantra I've heard for years, including in Pakistan and other countries, is that children in poor countries work or their families go hungry. There is no other option. In each third world country, there are firms and politicians who say children are better off in work. The subcontractor for a clothing giant in the West will claim that the 12-year-olds are grateful for the work and suffer no ill effects, and the Western clothing giant will secretly agree. And such arguments are not new. Child labour has been with us for centuries as each country industrialises its rich pitchfork all human material, including children, into hell of long hours, murderous conditions and early death. There is today 250 million child workers across this planet. And I suppose the question is, where is the outcry as to their physical destruction of their young bodies, the premature death, the torture of overwork, let alone the exclusion from schooling? There are factory workers in the Philippines, and these are the words of one 14-year-old boy who said, "When I started work at the factory, I often worked for 12 hours a day. There is forced overtime, enough sometimes to make people very ill. Sometimes the hours are so long that we end up sleeping in the factory. Those who try to organize a union or talk to the press are finished at the factory. They will never work again at any of the plants in this zone." So if you're a child worker in Thailand or Indonesia or anywhere else, it's today, if you transported them back to this country in 1800, they would instantly recognize the working conditions that exist for them. In Britain's silk factories in 1840s, employers said the industry could not run without children's lightness of touch, and so children were slaughtered for the sake of their delicate fingers. Chimney sweeps were recruited at the age of 4 years old. Small boys were needed with bones soft enough to crawl through tiny chimney flues, or coffins of black, as the poet William Blake called them. And such tragic cases of child labour are not confined to history books. Yesterday was Bonfire Day, and as I said, I was at Glasgow Green with many other families, I suspect, in this room, with their children. And we should remember that only a few years ago, at least 37 children were killed in a primary school in China after an explosion, where children, some as young as 8, were forced to make fireworks at a school to increase funds. So as a parent, I've read much about the importance of play, much about the importance of education, and how it really is play is a child's most important learning tool. But in a world, I think, busy, full of time constraints, money constraints, we all need the resources, we all need the tools so that we can get to help our kids just be kids. But what I would really say is that, as Nicola touched upon, is that we need to look outside ourselves, outside our own children, outside our own families, outside our own schools, outside our own towns, villages and cities, but actually look across the world to what impact we can actually make on children's futures, on whether they be from Scotland, Americas, Asia or Africa. It doesn't really matter. They are all our children. Thank you.